You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Today we're going to be asking the question, what is photography? And to help us analyze this thorny question, we are joined by photographer and art historian Cory Rice. Cory, along with our very own John Harris, launched a portrait project earlier this year with that very same name, and the results of that collaboration are now published on the B&H Explora website. We'll supply the links to this series in our show notes, but a quick Google of B&H and Explora will take you to our homepage. We will discuss with Cory the making of the series. We will also intersperse some comments on the subject taken from a recent What is Photography artist panel held in conjunction with the exhibition at the Hasselblad Gallery. And toward the end of the episode, we'll speak with Stanley Sterrell, the winner of our Lumix Day Sweepstakes, to see how he's enjoying his brand new Panasonic GX85 and 2 lenses. But first, welcome to Cory Rice.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Early last year, John and Cory started kicking around the idea of asking photographers and creative types associated with photography, what is photography? They spoke with artists, curators, academics, editors, and many photographers, 40 in all, and their responses represent a spectrum of thought on the topic, all equally fascinating. As visual complements to the responses, Cory captured interpretive portraits of each of the participants. The words of the subjects and Cory's portraits are a wonderful tandem. The project culminated last month with a show of black and white portraits and accompanying quotes at the Hasselblad Experience Studio located in Lower Manhattan. The show and the opening were even better than I had anticipated. And now the series is being published on the B&H Explora site and is scheduled to exhibit a few more times in the coming months. But we'll let Cory tell us all about that. So anyway, I don't know, less than a year ago, you guys started kicking around this idea about what is photography and a series about that. Cory, tell us the seeds of this thing and a little bit of outline, how it all happened.
Well, John, of course, has been working on the podcast, and I had been doing a few artist interviews for Explora, and we had the idea of making a project about photography where we could bring in artists, sit them down, talk to them, and then make a portrait of them and sort of bring those two ideas together and create a sort of ongoing series and maybe learn something about photography.
Was your goal to create a portrait that would reflect the comments, or were they just always going to be independent?
No, in the process, a lot of times we didn't get the comment until after. So it was when we were making the portraits, I mean, there's a little bit of inspiration from the artist's work or the person's background or field. We asked participants to bring in objects if they wanted to, relative to what they were thinking about photography. So sometimes you had for example, Sam Cannon brought in one of her a sculptural work that she had done. Eleanor Carucci brought in her daughter. Her work is about family.
Right.
Other times it was more engaging with the person and sort of seeing what their personality was like. We got some surprises along the way with that.
Any disappointments?
No, never
That's
disappointment.
Good. And I was just, because it's interesting. There are a lot of creative types. You ask them to speak about their work, and there's really nothing to say. You don't always have a personality behind even incredible work.
Right. Well, I would say, I was a little bit surprised, maybe not so surprised by the fact that there were a lot of photographers that as soon as they were on the other side of the camera got a little bit uncomfortable. But I can be sympathetic to that.
Yeah. And there were a few people who this idea, I remember, I forget who it was, I think Alexander Porter, when I reached out to him about this subject, he said, that's a question that plagues me 24 hours a day. So for them, this is kind of their stock in trade, answering this kind of question. He's more of a theoretical guy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I thought that some of them were a little uncomfortable trying to be nailed down to one answer, but we kind of worked it out of them in some cases. We had to kind of pull and like the interview process, they generally took place during the photo shoots. So Cory would be shooting somebody and I would be speaking to somebody else. And we had sometimes half an hour or an hour-long interview. And from that, we were able to pull out sometimes just like a one-line quote. But the conversations are great in general.
Was anybody groveling with an answer to that? Because it's kind of a hard thing. It is a hard thing to answer.
Yeah, I would say that some people, it took them a half an hour of conversation to get to the answer. It seemed like, or something they were comfortable with. And other people came completely prepared, like with a statement written out or one line, something you could tell they had thought about that for a long time and were really ready to give that answer. So yeah, it crossed it was a complete spectrum.
I think by the end of it, you got pretty good at teasing it out of people.
Yeah, you did. I mean, you had to, like, there was a couple, you learn your little tricks, I suppose. Sometimes we talk about something and then just drop it in on them, But other people were great. They would send me something ahead of time, and a few people sent long, several paragraphs with context, and we edited it down, but it was great.
And I think that's another important thing to mention about the project is that in many cases it's not just one quote, but if you go onto the Explora webpage and you click through and see, you get the extended quote. So it's a little bit, not a one-liner in many cases, but maybe like a paragraph or so.
Oh, okay. All right. Now, you were very consistent through this entire project. You worked in the same studio with the same backdrop, the same camera and lens. Give us a little bit of background into that.
Well, so conceptually, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the equipment that we were working with, we knew that we were going to be shooting over the course of a couple of months. So working over a long period of time and with a lot of different people, we wanted to keep something distinct in the project so that when you looked at the images...
There had to be a consistency to it. Yes.
So what we decided to do is I said, well, let's shoot for the stars. Let's get the best of the best that we can work with. And so we were shooting with Hasselblad's H series cameras for all of the portraits. The first shoot, we had one of their 100 megapixel sensors, and then for the rest, we had a 50 megapixel sensor. We got a backdrop from Oliphant Studios over in Bushwick. So we got them to loan that to us for the duration of the project. So we had that. We made a point of having it in every single image. So even if it's just a little sliver in the shot, it's there in every single one. So we wanted to keep that sort of consistent. And we shot everything in Highlight Studios. So this was an incredible studio, north-facing light. It's like shooting in a greenhouse. It's just beautiful light everywhere. And that made things really easy.
By the way, back if you turn back the clock over 100 years, all the photo studios in Manhattan were essentially in the spaces like you were working in, a top floor with a huge, slanted window facing. That was the light. That was the studio.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we were sort of aiming for. And it kind of continuing with that, we ended up making all of the images black and white. So it adds to that sort of thinking back to the history of portrait photography and portrait studios. And yeah, the light was great.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you about. It is all black and white, and it's lovely, and it's a consistency to it. It really holds together as a unit. Were you always black and white oriented towards this? Because shooting with the Hasselblad, you're capturing color anyway. So
Right.
did you debate any? Did you do any in color just to see how they played out before you committed?
Of course, we were shooting in color, so we saw what they looked like in color, and there were a couple instances where John and I sort of went back and forth about whether we would make an exception for one image or something like that. We decided against it in the long run, but there's definitely some images from the project that are in color that I still love as just color images.
Because that could work equally well. You could have predominantly, monochrome, and every once in a while a little pop of color where it comes up. But I was curious to know whether that was a consideration at all.
It definitely came up. Yeah, it definitely came up in conversation for sure. But one thing I wanted to ask or comment on and ask, because I tend to forget exactly how a lot of these ideas first came to be.
Yeah, who started it? Who initiated this conversation?
Yeah, that's
guys?
a good question.
I think we were getting a coffee one day, right?
Yeah, well, we were talking about trying to do a project that was a little different from what we normally see on the B&H site. And Cory's an experienced portrait photographer and art photographer. So we thought, let's try to use those talents and how we're gonna kind of integrate it in something that would work for our site, and
that B&H would also be okay with,
and that B&H still be okay with. And in my memory, it all kind of was like a cobblestone, a yellow brick road. We kind of said, all right, well, if we can get this backdrop that you really wanted to work with, Oliphant backdrops, which are somewhat legendary in the business.
Yeah.
Annie Leibovitz uses them. They're all over Vanity Fair, and they produce for Broadway shows, and
Not to be a name dropper, but I have also rented from Sarah Oliphant in the past.
Really? Wow.
yes, I
okay, we
have.
got to note that then. And anyway, so we reached out to them, and they were great, and they said, "Yeah, sure, we'll loan you one." I mean, everything that we got, we had to kind of ask for because there wasn't any budget for this project at the beginning. And once they said yes, we kind of realized, all right, well, we have something going here. And then we were able to get the studio and we were able to get the camera, and these things all pieced together. And then we kind of decided, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And as Cory mentioned, because we were thinking about a wide variety of people and bringing in different views on the subject and views that we don't often talk about here at B&H, more from the art side and the theoretical side. I guess the idea to keep the look consistent was the one thing that would remain consistent, other than the three items that we mentioned. And
I think it's also worth mentioning that the goal of this project wasn't to sell anything at all. This was strictly art.
Yeah, it was,
and the company
yeah.
backed you up on it, which I think is really tremendous.
And I think as the project developed, to me, it became kind of a documentary project in the sense of, all right, we're documenting what photography is now to this crew of people in the New York scene. Although not everyone was from New York. But
now you photographed, 40 people altogether and interviewed. How many people did you reach out to out of that? Because I know that not everyone was agreeable to this for whatever reasons.
Well, geez, how many do we reach out to? That's probably double that.
About double.
I mean, we came up with a list at the beginning of the kind of the 10 or 15 people that we really thought we would like to be involved, and a handful of those said yes. Most either never responded or were unavailable. I mean, we get a lot of positive responses, but people just couldn't fit it in the schedule because we were trying to cram everything into this 2-month period, and it was in the summertime. But
I think it helped too once we started to have images to show people. Yeah. When we very first started out, it was a little bit trickier because nobody was really sure what we were doing.
It was vapor, but all of a sudden you have something concrete, and they go, okay, they're serious, and it's good.
And in some ways we got lucky because that first day, our first day of shooting, we had Eleanor Carucci and Amr, and those two photos turned out to be great, and the vibe that they brought to the whole day was helpful. And with those two photos, we were able to, I think, gather in a lot of people. I think the fact that Eleanor was involved and the photos were,
there was credibility, all of a sudden.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, when somebody was photographed and they enjoyed it, they said, "Hey, why don't you think about so and so?" So we called them. So the thing kind of took a life of its own in some way. And but we did reach out to a lot of people, and we kind of aimed high in the terms of getting some real celebrities and some huge names in the photo world.
Now, you used photographers, but it was not all photographers. What are the categories of people that you interviewed? Now, I know you had a book publisher, at least one publisher, curators,
editors, academics, technicians, and a lot of photographers and people who cross the line, videographers, filmmakers.
Right.
Josh Begley, whose answer when we asked him what is photography, he says, I don't know. I've never owned a camera, but he does.
I've owned a lot, and I'm still not sure.
Yeah, exactly. And he's somebody, I guess you'd call him a digital artist. He creates apps and he pulls images from the web to create photo series that are kind of questioning what photography is in our day and age. So it was a pretty wide range, and that was the idea. Most of that came through Cory, I would say, or at least his thinking on the subject.
We didn't want it to be just photographers. We kind of wanted to see all of the different types of people that get involved in the photography world. It was a big
people
part of
that just basically crisscross photography.
Right. Yeah.
It's part of their life. What was the most esoteric response you got, or one that took you by that, blindsided you?
I would say that the answers kind of broke down into 4 or 5 different types of answers. Some people were talked about connecting with other people. Other people talked about photography as a language to tell their stories. There was a group of people that I would say were people who were talked about manipulating light and time to do something new, and like Josh and a few other people, there were people said, well, I'm not really a photographer, or am I a photographer? You know, they were questioning our question, you know, Sam Cannon being one of them. And Sam is an artist and a director who is known for her music videos and animated GIFs that tend to blur the line between still and motion photography.
I don't know if I'm a photographer. I do primarily work in video. I work in a lot of really short videos. That doesn't really mean anything today because most videos are really short now, but it can range anywhere from 15 seconds to a couple of minutes. Basically just not feature-length films. And I'm really interested in making looping videos that don't have a clear start and end point. I really like to think about making images moving images specifically, that you would approach similarly to how you would approach a sculpture or a painting in a gallery, where no matter how much time you spend with it, it won't necessarily give you any more information, but the amount of time that you sit there with it, you might derive more from it or have a different experience from someone else. But most of the work that I make, even though it's video, the narrative it's not a linear narrative. There's just a limited amount of information. I studied at RIT in Rochester, New York, upstate. And before going to undergrad, I had a really, really hard time deciding if I wanted to study photography or if I wanted to go to film school. And I ultimately chose photo. And I think it was mostly because I wanted to be able to manipulate images pretty easily. And at that point, my understanding of that lent itself better to photography than it did to video. I also am very interested in working alone. I like being in my studio. I like kind of like wandering around in landscapes alone and making pictures. And the idea of being a part of a huge film crew didn't sound fun to me at all. So I went to photo school, and I like immediately regretted it. Because I loved the school that I went to. I had a great experience, but I missed the motion so much, and I knew that there was this huge thing that was missing, and I didn't know how to get it back, and I didn't want to change the path that I was on, and so I started making GIFs. It was just kind of accidental. This was like 2011, 2012, and GIFs were mostly just being shared on Tumblr as like reactionary images or recaps from TV shows. And there were some illustrators that were making really cool artwork using them, and a couple of videographers and photographers, but there really weren't that many people using it in that way yet. A lot of the work that I make is about bodies, about women's bodies specifically, about the way that images of bodies are shared and consumed online, but also the work itself is usually speaking somehow to just the internet and image manipulation and the way that we understand images. I've always felt that, especially now, people assume that most images are manipulated, that it's like become a part of our larger understanding that when we see things online, they're not real. And I find a lot of freedom in that and a lot of permission. I like to use liquid in my work because I'm normally dealing with women's bodies, and I'm normally doing some kind of collage, even if it's subtle. I'm putting multiple images together, and so working in collage, I wanted to find a way to collage women's bodies that didn't feel violent to me. Collage traditionally is a process of like cutting things up or removing things, and so I felt that if I used liquid, I could use it as a way to reveal information and reveal what I wanted to shoot, rather than having a process of like extracting something, which didn't seem right. And then liquid is also, it's beautiful, so that's kind of an easy entry point. But also, I feel like it speaks to a transitional space, a like fluid, constantly changing space, and then also the womb, and like the sounds that I make for the videos are usually womb-like or sound like ultrasounds and things that I find really like calming, droning things that you listen to. So I have a lot of different entry points when I'm making things. If it's a commercial assignment, sometimes I do know exactly what I'm gonna have to make, and so then it becomes like how am I gonna make this look like something I would make? As I feel like I'm pretty equally split between seeing an image in my head and then going and trying to execute that. And then I also work a lot in a way where I'm just kind of like gleaning as much footage as I can and then going, because I'm building a lot of these things in After Effects. And so it's a lot of just like putting things together and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And I really enjoy that process, but it also, it's not restrictive enough. And so it can get really overwhelming. And I think it's nice to jump between those two things. Part of the reason why I fell in love with making GIFs early on was because they were so restrictive. And I really fell in love with like, how can I tell a story in this format? How can I make something that I think is beautiful, but is still going to be able to upload somewhere? I really loved doing that. So I think, I think that balance of like giving yourself a bunch of rules and then trying to make the most interesting thing that you can within those parameters is always a good place to start. I shoot everything, so I'll get all of the footage. I use a lot of different cameras. I primarily shoot with either Canon or Sony, and then I build the final video out in After Effects, and sometimes still will go into Photoshop for certain things if I need to, but I'm mostly just working in After Effects. People don't always realize that I'm shooting the things that I'm making, or how many actual things are added. They're like, oh, it's just a landscape that has one thing in it. I'm like, no, that's like 300 different layers of things in that video. But yeah.
Thank you so much. All right, cool.
The answers that you got to the question are all over the place. Which ones do you think connect between the answer and the visual? Are there any that sort of, you look at the two and you'd say, okay, that's a match?
Well, I think in the editing process, when I was making the image, if I hadn't already heard what the quote was going to be, and it was more of, like I was speaking of earlier, where it was sort of a collaboration and figuring out something about the person's personality or trying to reflect their work, when we got around to the editing process and the selection process, we did have the quote. We knew what we were going to publish with it. So that was kind of one of the influences when we were making our decisions. So we tried to keep it somewhat, related, I think, in many cases. Eleanor's image, I think, is one of the ones, saying, what was it, John? To connect to people better? Yeah,
it was her way of connecting to people, and that started with my family and has been growing out ever since.
Right. So she brought in her daughter, and we had a very close crop image of the two of them, and I thought that works really beautifully with the quote. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, another thing we did, which was, we didn't plan this at all, but I think it worked out pretty well, is that the studio we were using is located in the Penumbra Foundation, as you know, and in the closets and in the corners are old camera equipment.
No matter where you look,
right, there's something. I mean, and not to mention all the general equipment you would find in a photo studio. So we try to utilize some of that material there and some of those items to incorporate, in some ways, just to kind of give life to an image and have something something for somebody to hold or lean on or whatnot. But ultimately, it kind of also spoke to this idea of what is photography, because we were using things that spoke to the history of photography as well as the kind of the practice of photography within the studio. And I think that was just a little bit of a lucky twist.
Was Jeff upset that you didn't shoot tintypes for this project?
No, but Jeff was involved, and we did one of the photos that didn't make it into the final cut was Jeff Berliner surrounded by 30 antique and vintage lenses, kind of floating above his head.
He does own over 1,000 lenses, brass lenses, this guy.
That might have been the hardest shoot, I would say, or the hardest day. Yeah.
But we got some good ones of him, too.
Yeah, we got, and the one of him and Jolene.
With the frame
framed by a vintage camera was pretty nice.
Did you have like one particular shot or one setup scenario for each of your subjects, or did you play around multiple with some or all of them?
We had a couple for each. We wanted to make sure that we had some variety to look at whenever we're making our selection. And then sometimes we would start off with something very simple and kind of realize halfway through that this is a little bit boring. Let's do something else. And we would change it up. And I'd say a good number of them sort of, well, I don't know. I mean, sometimes we had the shot at the very beginning, and sometimes we had it at the end. I mean, it's photography, right?
Yeah.
No, but Cory was good in kind of trusting his instincts there. If he thought he had something, pretty quickly he would say, all right, I got it, and if not, let's go back and...
What
And
percentage?
then John would say, are you sure? Are you sure?
Or a couple times you shot, and then I brought the folks over and we talked for a while, which gave you a chance to go back and look at the images and maybe also change the vibe a little bit and have them kind of relax. And then they went back and shot them again, and that shot might have been the better one.
Did you show the pictures to your subjects while they were there? Did they see anything on site?
If they asked to, I would show them to them, but we didn't make a point of immediately showing it to them. Yeah.
All right, okay.
Mark Mann, when he came and sat, he wanted to see the images, so we showed him his portraits, and he jumped right into Photoshop and started editing his image. He was like, all right, here you go. It's beautiful image. I'm like, all right, I think I'm going to do that myself, but appreciate it.
Well, didn't he at one point say, wait, are you doing one of my photos? Because he's kind of known for these tight cropped portraits of celebrities and politicians and whatnot. Actually, what was interesting about that is we like Cory mentioned, we had asked people to bring in some items that might be important to their photography, and some people brought like an old camera, or as he mentioned, this mask
or a child.
But he said, I can't really think of anything, but I do have the stool that Obama sat on when I photographed him, and we were like, well, why don't we get that? So I jumped in a subway, ran down to his studio, which is down in Chinatown, and brought it back, and it didn't make it. I mean, we didn't use that shot, I don't think, but it was nice having it there anyway. A little touch of history.
Sure.
Yeah, he was great. He was really fun to talk to, and he had a good answer ready too. So yeah.
So you had a show downtown, which was great. We were all at the opening.
Yeah.
Was very well received, and you're now publishing on the B&H Explora website. Everything that went into it is now out there.
Well, not quite.
You're still in the process of coming. You're doing it in
Yeah,
sections.
we're putting out 2 photos a week.
Okay.
And I'd say we're not quite halfway through. So the series will be published ongoing probably into February, I guess. And we're actually hoping to start it up again and make this an ongoing thing, but that's TBD.
What about a book, a physical book? You thinking about it? Any offers? Any?
No offers, but it's something that was mentioned, and I think it could fit. Maybe if we continue and get a few more people and continue down this line, it might be something to consider. But yeah, and it's something that we weren't really. It came up in the middle of the whole process. We felt that there's a really good vibe. People would come in, and someone would be leaving from their portrait session, and someone would be coming, and they would talk for a few minutes. And we kind of thought it would be great if we could just get everybody together, one location, one time, and do maybe an exhibit. And
a great day on West 30th Street.
that would have been cool.
Against the brownstone on the steps. I can see it all now.
Right.
I can see it.
But Hasselblad was cool. They said they liked the photos when we showed them to him. Dan Wang, thank you, Dan. And he offered their space to do an exhibit, which we did, and it worked out pretty well. Not everybody, of course, showed up, but many of the people who were photographed came. And I think
it felt like a community.
Yeah,
sure.
Thank you. That was kind of what I was trying to get at. We felt like through this project we put together kind of a small community of people, and we wanted to keep them together and get them to know each other, and that was the idea of the series of the exhibit. And
I think one of the other funny things that kept happening was when one person would be leaving the studio, walking out, they'd run into our next person or somebody else in the building, and they would already know them. So it felt like we were building a community, but the community was also, to some extent, already built.
You're just reinforcing it. That's
right.
it. You're just adding another block of reinforcement to it.
Yeah, which I thought, led to this idea of a document of time and place. That was it kind of gelled. Sometimes a project takes a life of its own, and I think this happened. I think that as the project grew and as the vibe got better, and the work, Cory's work was clearly good. People gravitated toward it, and that was really nice.
What kind of things? Now, you went into this project with certain expectations and understandings and perspectives. How did it change at the end? Are you looking back at it from a different point of view, or would you approach it differently again or moving forward based on what you already have experienced?
I don't know if we had too many expectations going in. I think a lot of it was we were kind of flying by the seat of our pants a little bit. There was no budget. I think we were both surprised that the people that gave us their backdrop and their gear actually did give it to us for that time, with really no questions asked. It was like, yeah, go ahead. And we said that if this ever comes together, we'll link you guys and talk about your gear and stuff. But we weren't even sure that B&H would publish it when we started photographing this. This is what I was kind of getting at before. It seemed like in the middle that the best result for this would be an exhibit. It seemed to feel that way. It seemed to feel almost more so than a publication, than an exhibit, and bringing people together, kind of a celebration, was the best outcome for this, and we were able to do that. And actually, we're going to do more. We have a couple of exhibits planned at Depth of Field here at B&H, and something that's just getting organized now for International Women's Day. And so I think there'll be a long life to this project, no matter whether we photograph more or not. But to answer your question, I think that, just this general idea of community, that people really kind of came together around the project, that was the nicest part.
I think less what I would do differently, because I'm very happy with what we did do, but more kind of seeing where it grows from here. Sort of like John was just saying, like it takes the form originally of editorial content on a website, turns into an exhibition, turns into an artist panel, turns into different events that bring people together. A podcast, right? So that's kind of my thinking about it. Is like, where will this go next?
Okay, so you spent a good chunk of this past year coming up with the project, executing it, and actually putting up a show and everything else, and taking your bows. So at the end of the day, what is photography?
Oh, geez. When I look at photography, it's more about using a camera or using whatever form of photography you're doing to convey some sort of message, whether it be about something social related, something political, something artistic. I've never really separated it that much from any other form of visual representation. I just think it's, painter picks up a paintbrush, a photographer picks up a camera sort of thing.
We may want to jump to Maciek's quote right now, because one of his points had to do with the relationship with photography and painting in his work. Maciek Jacek is a fine art and editorial photographer. His personal and his commercial work uses color and bewildering physical phenomena to explore our relationship with identity, gender, and the natural world. Here's Maciek.
So the first thing I ever did, I was inspired by painting a lot when I first started doing, I guess, my own kind of work when I was assisting other photographers. And I just, basically, most of my work is just finding different ways of achieving the effects of paintings through different materials that I put in front of the lens or on the lights, or and just my way of reinventing how people look and how landscapes work. And so I started with portraits, and it's just a way of stripping everything down. And I would usually, when I work on the color portraits, is that I ask people to have their shoulders bare, because it creates, for me, more of a sense of intimacy. And I use these colors to kind of find a emotional channel for people to connect with people. There's so many different ways of showing how people are. And for me, it's not as much about showing how they look, but maybe more how they make us feel, or how they feel themselves.
And all of this is, as you said, in-camera technique. So can you describe a little bit of the process? I know you use prisms and obviously filters and gels, and I imagine
all of the above.
Yeah.
Basically, and I'm a fan with a lot of other photographers that basically just use any kind of materials you can, whether it's plastic gels, or I know one photographer uses color wigs. There's all these really interesting ways of putting in color or distorting that are not only, because I think for me, I do photography because it's not deliberate like painting, it's kind of accidental. And I'm often just as surprised as anyone who sees the photo. So I'll use any of these different kinds of glass, almost anything, because there's just a wealth of possibilities that can come from that.
And do you go through periods of time where it's only glass, only prisms, and you find something else and you go to that? Or is it always kind of a tool chest to pull from?
I tend to have a few tools that I use, but if I have a new tool, then I kind of go crazy for it. And then it's a lot of times I've started this with portraits, and then I'll be well, if it works for portraits, can it work for landscapes? And I just try to find new ways. And sometimes it might take me like a year or two just to even figure out how to use a prism or something else.
Interesting. And this experimentation with color, though, doesn't necessarily extend to backdrops, costuming, or is it all having to do more with the light that is being created?
It'll be like in front of the lens. It'll be on the lights. Mostly like that, just because I think for me, I like to work with restrictions. Because if I can do like anything, then I get kind of overwhelmed. I'm like, what the hell do I do right now? So I'm just like, let me do this, this, and this. And that's kind of like, and especially working commercially, I get like 5 or 10 minutes sometimes with people.
Really?
So I really don't have the time to dick around.
Right. Let's see what we got next. Oh, wow. Look at that.
So it's basically, this is just a series of nudes that I started doing, the same techniques as the portraits, but I really had emphasis on movement and trying to find different ways of making movement, because a lot of people times when they see nudes, it looks like sculpture or it looks like dance. People are like, oh, it looks like sculpture, dance. You kind of shut off emotionally.
Right.
But for me, I was like, well, is there a way to show this as a way, like, is this person floating in water, or like what's happening? And for me, building that kind of mystery is really interesting and fascinating.
All right. And this?
Commercial assignment.
Oh, okay.
It was for a musician named Ariana and the Rose, and we were shooting actually a music video in Southern California. And then she was like, well, let's just do some photos really quick, since we've been up since 5 a.m. And it was just a really cool place like this that I was able to just like kind of layer a certain number of colors and just kind of push the reality just a little bit. And then just kind of sneak them into the middle of the frame and just kind of play with all like the textures, things that were already there, and kind of build on them with color. And
do you feel, if you had to choose between studio and out in a landscape like this, does it make a difference? I mean, do you enjoy it equally?
I enjoy it equally. It's just that when you're on location, all the logistics are really hard, but you have all these like amazing places that you can like reinvent and use, whereas the studio is much more like restricted, but it's so comfortable.
Great. And another one?
So this is more recent work, a project called Deeply Ordered Chaos. It comes from a lot of my like admiration and wonder about Francis Bacon paintings, and making photography even more like painting, where I'm like using like in-camera techniques. This is using a prism for kind of really kind of pushing the boundaries of how a person can look, and kind of still retaining human qualities, and also like heavily distorting people, and also in these like kind of very organic ways.
Okay. And another one?
It's in Utah, and I'm using the prism in the landscape. And I'm just basically reflecting parts of the other landscape into this landscape.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it's kind of difficult, because instead of like framing it like, okay, this is what it's going to look like, I have to frame how this landscape is going to like reflect into this landscape. So it becomes kind of very convoluted, but it affords me this opportunity to totally reinvent the landscape.
And how long will you be out there for a shoot like that?
I was out there for about 3 days, shooting like dusk till dawn.
Really?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Wow.
And this is the most recent thing. This was in Iceland a month ago with my girlfriend, creative partner, Erica, who's in the back there. We only were able to shoot in Iceland one day because it was pretty cold. It was like snowing and raining half the time. But we had one day of shooting, and we were using the prism. And this is like the newest work, which we're really excited by, of like finding ways of sneaking like humans into this landscape in this kind of like mysterious, strange way. So we're really excited by it.
I like that. That's great.
So after all is said and done, after photographing these people, hearing their responses, anybody's quote or thoughts that maybe just really triggered you a little bit and made you just stop and pause and reassess what you already had going on in your head?
I think one of the more interesting quotes that came out of this project came from Lev Manovich, who's a theorist of media. He's written about Instagram, digital culture, those sorts of topics. And his short answer was essentially that a photograph is what a computer can't do. And I think today, especially with the rise of digital and how much digital technology is getting into the camera and behind the camera, that made me think and sort of wonder where photography is going. What will the answer to this question be in 20 years?
Yeah. By the way, did you see that there was an article about
artificial intelligence?
All those AI-generated portraits of
I sent you the
people
video
never
for that last night.
Yes.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
it's actually
crazy.
quite frightening. I
Yesterday.
mean, for those of you wondering what we're talking about, there was a a series of portraits that were released that were all put together through artificial intelligence. The people do not exist, but you'd swear you know all these
Old people, babies.
Yeah, I mean, it
was
was very frightening to see all that stuff.
not as frightening as a baby with teeth. Did you see that one?
Oh, I shared that with a lot of people. Yes, I loved it.
But one thing that we didn't seem to cover a lot in this, although we did have a sports photographer, we didn't have, and many of the photographers do commercial work, there's no doubt, but we tried to shy away from some of the areas of photography that B&H covers a lot, which would be landscape
Weddings.
photographers, wedding photographers, to some degree, wildlife photographers. But interestingly enough, we did talk a lot about where the divide between a commercial work is and where an artistic work is, you know, how these photographers look at different aspects of their photography. One thing I found interesting with the people that we had is that there's, and this may get back to this idea that we tended to look more to the art and, in my case, the documentary and photojournalistic side, but we had kind of this clean split between people who were about documenting their story and doing it as true as possible, if you can use that word in photography anymore. And then we had this other set of people who were all about manipulation, you know, the idea of just putting a pure image wouldn't even be part of their thought process, you know. I think what was Ben Zank's quote? Something, you know, is bending reality to my will, you know, that kind of idea. And I guess that's the history of photography, right? I mean, documenting what you see and trying to, you know, create something that you don't see. But we had a nice little group representing both camps, I thought.
I always found no difference between straight and manipulated photography because every photograph you take is manipulated. Okay, if you're shooting color, the film itself determines the color, not you or your settings. Okay, there's certain presets. And even just making tonal adjustments to your picture, you are changing what is so. Even if you just have a phone, you see what you can do to your picture on your phone, you're manipulating no matter what. And even the capture.
And that's what Maciek said to some degree.
It's a 2D representation of a 3D world.
Right. Yeah, it's a transformation.
I think when a lot of people see my work, they're like, oh, I really like it. How'd you do it in Photoshop? And that's just like the expectation that it's fake. And when I'm like, no, they're like, oh. And then they get kind of confused. And then they're like, all right, now how do you do it? And I'm like, no, let's keep it mysterious, man. And that's usually doesn't fly that great. But that is the same idea. I think that we live in a world where there's so much things that are fake that when you like kind of insist that something is real or like it's not what someone thinks, you know, we've lost that ability to kind of see what's real. I mean, it's obviously a huge problem. But also, as visual artists, we kind of have to keep that in mind at all times.
Yeah. Actually, it reminds me, the gentleman in the photograph who's back there with his hand in here, his name is Amr Alfiki, and his quote, it was shortened, photography is revolution, but the longer quote goes on to say that, you know, if photography is not truth, we're in a lot of trouble, you know, which speaks to this. But I also want to throw this over to Miranda. I thought that your quote, responsibility and revolution, went hand in hand with each other very well. And your work clearly is documentary based and not a lot of manipulation, or at least it wouldn't seem that way. How do you feel about that subject of manipulation? Are you? Miranda Barnes is a documentarian and photojournalist whose clients include the New York Times, Time, Vogue, and New Yorker magazine. Here's Miranda.
And because I went to a criminal justice school, that manipulation was like never a thing. So I feel like I've never been able to like experiment. And maybe hopefully down the line I can, but yes, I cannot doctor any of my photos. Time, New York Times. It's like, even when I like have to text an editor, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna edit the photos. They're like, what do you mean by that? I'm like, no, you mean just look at all them through. Because they want to make sure. You have one shot. We didn't show it. I don't think we did, but it's the theater seat and in the Martin Luther King series. Which, you know, it could be any theater anywhere or even a church or something like that, but it's just dripping with so much meaning when you know the context of it. But it also could be, in a weird way, like a created image. You know, it's just this little piece of design element of a chair. Yeah, people ask me a lot about that. I wish I should have put it in, but people are like, how did you put that light there? And I'm like, well, it was coming through the stained glass. I saw an opportunity and I took it, you know. But yeah, I have to be very, very pragmatic about the photos that I take and how I take them, because unfortunately I can't, doctor anything.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. Yeah.
It's pretty varied. It's a wide spectrum of personalities.
And also, we were fortunate to get some of the people who are the top of their field. We had, like I said, a pretty wide range of people. I can give you, let me run on the list that I have here. We had Aaron Barnett, who is the director of exhibitions and collections at ICP. We had Chris Stein, who is the founder and the guitarist from the band Blondie, and is also a photographer. Santiago Leon, he's the director of editorial content at Adobe and a Pulitzer-Prize winner. Jamel Shabazz, great photographer. As we mentioned, Eleanor Carucci, Mark Mann, Sandra Stevenson, New York Times editor. We had August Prost, who's a printer and owner of LTI Lightside. Mary Mattingly. Who else do we have? Cynthia Santos Briones, who's an anthropologist and only started photographing for her anthropology work, just to kind of document the people she was dealing with, and then developed her craft as a photographer. And she had an interesting insight. We had Teru Kuwayama, he's a photojournalist, co-founder of Light Stalkers and the former photo community manager at Facebook. And we brought in Gershon Eisenberger from B&H, who developed some camera gear back in the day, Vivitar Flash.
The Vivitar 283 and 85.
Macro zoom lens. Who knew that, he
Oh, I didn't know. He really? Okay, I didn't know that one.
Yeah.
And he also, for those of you who've been in the store, the trolleys with all the little baskets that shoot around, the same guy designed that system too.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know
Oh,
that.
yeah. He
cool.
designed that whole thing when they opened up the store.
Cool.
So where do we go from here, Cory? What's the future of this project?
On Explora. So
Any traveling shows or anything like that coming up where people would be able to see it firsthand?
Well, I'll be doing a talk at Depth of Field in February.
Which is here in New York City.
Right.
It's a 2-day event
A wedding
this
and
year.
portrait conference, 2 days at the New Yorker Hotel.
Which is free. Stay tuned for that.
We're working out some other things, but they're not quite as ironed out yet.
Yeah. Well, right now, it's about continuing to get the images published. And, for anyone out there listening, I totally encourage you to go to the site, to check out the images, to comment, to share. And, I'm making a straight up, plug that advance this project for us so that we can do more projects like this. And also the other people that work with us, a lot of talented photographers and writers can do these kind of projects.
I will say this is, having worked here for many, many years on the Explora website for B&H, this is probably one of the most exciting projects that we've had here. I thought it was pretty terrific that the company gave you the time to do this, and they did very well. And it was it's just a benefit all the way around for everybody here. Good stuff.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool.
All right. We're going to take a short break, and we come back. We're going to be chatting with Stanley Sterrell, the winner of the Panasonic GX85 and 2 zoom lenses from our Panasonic Lumix Sweepstakes. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BH Photo Video, hashtag BH Photo Podcast.
Okay, a few weeks ago, we had a Panasonic event day in the New York City Superstore at B&H, and we set up a table, and we did a whole podcast from there. And part of the deal was we had a Panasonic Lumix DMC-GX85 sweepstakes, in which we were talking to customers, and they threw their names into a hat, and we chose a winner of a Panasonic Lumix DMC-GX85 mirrorless micro four thirds camera with a 12 to 32 and 45 to 150 millimeter zoom lenses thrown in. And we happen to have the winner of our sweepstakes here on the line, Stanley Sterrell of Florida, are you?
Well, I'm from Florida, but I moved to New York recently.
Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
It's terrific. So you got the camera, and the first thing you do is you send us pictures from prison. Thank you. We're joking around. No, Stanley sent us some pictures he took when he was in San Francisco of Alcatraz, so I couldn't help giving him a little bit of a rib on that one. So you're happy with your new camera?
It's amazing, actually. It's really amazing. It's my first mirrorless camera, actually.
What did you have before that? What camera were you using before you got this Panasonic?
The Canon 6D.
Okay. And what's the big difference between this system and the Canon? Obviously, big differences. But what's your take on it so far?
With the Lumix, it seems like it's an extremely good portable travel camera, secondary camera. Of course, like my 6D has a bigger sensor and it's full frame, and it's great for more of like my weddings and more professional work and so forth like that. But when I did take my trip to San Francisco, it just seemed like a crazy opportunity to use this small profile camera. So actually, I was able to put my big camera away because I did a lot of like walking around, and if anybody knows about San Francisco, it's pretty hectic when it comes to like being on foot. I was able to put my big camera away and solely use the Lumix to take lands and portraits and different things like that.
So your chiropractor is angry with you. Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much.
And even with the did you bring both lenses when you went, or did you just use the smaller lens?
No, I brought both lenses.
And the zoom lens, the telephoto zoom is equally or is small enough that you didn't have any problems carrying it around?
So, well, it's just spectacular. What ended up happening was like I got frustrated with my big camera, and majority of the time I use prime lenses, so it's a lot of switching and so forth like that. I deal with it on a wedding day just because I know the kind of image quality that I'm going to be able to receive. So I deal with it. But when it comes to like traveling and I just want to get the shot and keep it moving, it kind of became tedious. So when it came to me switching, like I literally got frustrated and I just switched to the Lumix solely. I was able to put the zoom lens in my pocket. And I was switching off instead of having to go into my bag back and forth. I was able to just switch off lenses, just going into my pocket and switching in, back and forth that way.
It may sound like not a big deal, but for me, that is a big deal. Having to dig into a bag when you're walking out in the street, to me, will have me shooting less photos. So it's good.
Which is why I wear cargo pants whenever I go out with a big DSLR. No, that's a huge issue, being able to just stick everything into your pockets. Also for traveling in general, especially if you're flying, to be able to carry all this stuff on board with you is huge.
And what about, you're using a DSLR, so now you have the mirrorless, you have the viewfinder, and are you using the screen or the viewfinder? How are you composing?
I'm actually using both, but probably more of the screen. The viewfinder seems to be, that's just one of the cons that I have with it, is that the viewfinder is pretty small. And if you do go into the viewfinder, like me, I have kind of like a pointy nose. So when I do, I have to dig into the viewfinder with my eyes, so my nose ends up touching the screen, which the screen is touch screen, so it will move the focal point. It'll move the focus point while I'm looking into. So I have to back up a little bit to look into the viewfinder, which I end up dealing with it, but it's something to mention.
Tell us a little bit about some of the pros and some of the cons. I mean, you mentioned one of the cons, and that's a good point. But what have you find other than the size that you're liking about it?
Any surprises?
Those were the two cons that I really only had with it. Everything else was just like surprises for me. It was very lightweight and portable, that, it's a mirrorless, so of course you're going to get that. But also what I found was the Wi-Fi capability was actually a good help to me. You download the app and you're able to use it on your Android or your Apple device. So, while you're on the go, because it seems like that's what a mirrorless small profile camera is supposed to be. It's supposed to be more convenient.
Absolutely.
So that was something very good. One of the biggest things that I found was that charging it via micro USB directly into the camera was something big for me when it came to traveling, because when you're on a plane or when you're out about and you can't find outlets, whether it's in California or even here in New York, you can just charge it up with a portable battery pack.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah,
that was an extreme big thing to me. But I mean, other than that, there's a lot of like customization that you can do to it. The screen, it doesn't swivel, but it does move out. And so
it's a tilting screen. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a tilting screen, right? So for video, it's pretty good when you want to, if like, I'm a bit tall, I'm not that tall, but when you want to bring it down to a level of your, whatever your subject is, you can bring it down by just swiveling up the screen and you'll be able to still see it perfectly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of it. As well, a big help to me was I ended up using it for landscapes. And so it has just so many features within it that gives you a bit of aid, whether it's the histogram or zebra lines, or a good one was, I'm not too sure, it was a leveler.
Mm-hmm.
The leveler within it. So I'm a big advocate of straight lines and a straight horizon, which I believe everyone is. But it's way better when you can do it in camera than having to do all of them in post. You know what I mean? So like even when I did the one with Alcatraz and of the Golden Gate Bridge, it was great to just look into the viewfinder or on the screen and just see a leveler that will give you green if it's like leveled, and then you're able to just move on that way. So that was a big surprise and very great help.
Did you find a big transition going from DSLR to a mirrorless camera? Was it kind of awkward for you?
Yeah, of course. Actually, I was on the verge of like swearing off mirrorless cameras because I just love the weight of a good DSLR, and it just makes me feel comfortable. And so like when I've like held the Sonys or so forth like that, I just never saw myself ever being able to use it just because of the comfortability factor. But when I did like just switch off into the Lumix, I guess it grew on me. And honestly, it's not me just trying to advocate for the Lumix. It just honestly, it just worked for me. So yes, it was a big difference, but it's something you can definitely get used to. Being that there's so many features, so many good features that comes with it, and the portability of it if you're a traveler.
And how about, did you handle the menus pretty easily? Was there any learning curve on that side, or much of a learning curve?
Of course. I haven't really used a Panasonic camera on the regular before, so it definitely was different from Canon, but it was pretty straightforward.
Right.
And that you can use the screen, and you don't have to just use like the tactile buttons on the right of it. It was pretty easy to get through.
Did you find yourself using the touchscreen a lot?
Yes. Yes. I'm a big advocate.
Intentionally, we're talking, not your nose.
Cool.
Oh, can I add something?
Yeah,
actually?
Please.
One of the biggest surprises that I found, and that I showed to some of my coworkers that I worked with before I went to California, was that it has a curves layer in it, and in the settings that you can use to
adjust the images, right?
To adjust, but not to adjust the images in post, but in live camera.
I see.
You can use it to change what I'm guessing whatever the plane is of your photo that you're about to take, which was a big surprise to me. And I work with people who's been doing photography for over 20 years, and that was even something new to them. So that's definitely a feature I would not want anybody else to pass on.
All right. Well, sounds good. Anything else you want to throw in there? I mean, any plans for using it? Will you incorporate it into some of your work as your second camera, or do you think that the Canon's going to get sold anytime too soon, or what's the future looking like?
Most definitely, I feel like I'm going to be able to add it into my workflow. Really, what I want to try it with is with the 4K video, although it does have the micro four thirds, but that is actually something that's been like a rave in the film community. So that's definitely something, the next venture. Have
you shot much video with it so far?
I haven't shot much video, and I've tried the video and was pretty impressed with it, just due to you being able to change the aspect ratios in it to get the black lines, or to at least get the black line references in it, and the picture just looks really good as well in it. So that's just the next venture.
Fantastic.
Well, it sounds like you're having a great time with your new camera. We're really happy for you. And Stanley, thank you so much for being a B&H customer, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you guys. It's a true blessing, man, just to meet you guys and have this opportunity. And yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy the heck out of your new camera and new lenses. And back here in the studio, thank you, Cory, for joining us again. And thank you to John for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Great talking about the show. And again, for those of you who are not familiar with What is Photography, just go to B&H Explora, Google What is Photography, B&H, and you'll be able to find a bunch of great stuff. Great comments, great photography. And for now, if you are not a subscriber to the B&H Photography Podcast, keep this in mind. The best things in life are free, and the B&H Photography Podcast is absolutely free. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, and you could always find us on the B&H Explora website. For now, on behalf of Cory, Jason, John, and myself, thank you so much for tuning in today.